we're starting. We have Mouhcine Guettabi, and I said that correctly,
right?
You
did.
All right, awesome. And Mouhcine is a professor of economics at UNCW and also a regional economist.
That's right.
So I got that right?
Yeah.
Cool. So,
2 for 2 so far.
Yeah, 2 for 2. All right. So yeah, thanks for coming on. And I've been to a lot of events in the local area with the Business Journal and the Chamber of Commerce, and I've had the opportunity to see you speak. And your the way you present economics it makes it fun and really actually pretty easy to understand. And so I'm excited to have you on, and we can talk more.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for the kind words, and happy to be here.
Yeah. So you were telling me you've done plenty of these podcasts and episodes and stuff. So
yeah.
You're an old pro. You probably
well, I'm not sure about that.
You have more experience than I do for sure. So, but basically the title and what we wanted to explore today was, what is economics?
Sure.
What does it mean for my small business here in Wilmington? And then I've got some questions about some macro type stuff, and maybe we can go there.
Sure.
And just kind of tie it all together. But really, just how can I'm a small business owner in Wilmington, or I'm a business leader, I'm an executive here. How can I leverage all the research and the data that you're putting out there to help make good informed business decisions?
Yeah.
So
no, I think that makes sense, and we can certainly start broad and then kind of deal with specific questions as we go. But I mean, you started with what is economics? It's an incredibly broad question, but I think I joke with my students that I tell them that if you're taking economics because you think I'm going to give you stock tips, you should drop the class, right?
Exactly.
And so, because that's definitely not what it is, right? And so, and then I tell them, really, the way I think about it, it's the study of human behavior, right? And so, and that's really thinking about how incentives shape decisions, right? And so it doesn't matter who you are or where you come from or what your business is, people respond to incentives, right? And so really it's trying to understand how people make decisions. And when I say people, that's individuals, that's businesses, how prices are determined in these markets, how policy decisions shift some of these incentives. What are the consequences of government decisions? What are the consequences of taxations? What are the consequences of trade, right? And so clearly the field of economics has many, many subfields, and the growth and the availability of computing power and availability of data has resulted in economists tipping their toes in a lot of different areas. Some people may say too many areas. Yeah. Because so really when you do a PhD in economics, it's the acquisition of tools that allows you to evaluate policy, to think about, empirically speaking, if you're an empiricist, how do you assess the impact of shocks? And those shocks can be at the individual level, at the business level, at the regional level, at the state level, at the national level, right? Yeah. And that's really my specialization is regional economics, but I'm an applied microeconomist. And so the way I'm going to sound very pompous, but the way we think about it is this idea of the effect, or trying to tease out the causal effect of policy shocks using what's referred to as quasi-experimental methods, meaning there is something that happened in the state, they've raised the minimum wage. How do we know if that increase in the minimum wage resulted in employment losses or in improvement in welfare? How do we do it in a credible, transparent way? So there are tons of causal techniques that allow an economist to come in and say, let's roll our sleeves, let's get data, let's use these methods, and let's tease out, rather than just be talking nonsense and making correlational statements, let's try to tease out these causal effects. I mean, that's just kind of one sliver of how I think, at least in my own world, about economics.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, going to college, you graduate and you have a degree, and what I've heard many professors say is that in college we're giving you the tools and the mindset on how to think and how to be a problem solver. We're not giving you the answers to the questions. We're giving you a foundation and a base to be able to go and then learn how to use those tools and
100%
processes.
One of the really attractive features of economics, but also one of the challenging aspects of convincing students to major in economics, is because there aren't that many jobs that say economist right out of college, right? And so, but you're teaching them a way of thinking, right? And so it's like there is this thing: think like an economist. Mm-hmm. Consider costs and benefits.
Yep.
Think about opportunity costs.
Yes.
Think at the margin. Think about interdependencies, right? And so really you're kind of conditioning people to think about these incentives that we're discussing, and you're equipping them with as many tools as possible. On the one hand, that makes you massively flexible and able to fit in anywhere. At the same time, for somebody that's risk averse, they're like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
What am I going to do? But I really think it's super attractive because it's broad enough, but it again exposes you to this way of thinking that you don't get in that many disciplines.
In economics, there's so much, math and quantitative data.
Yep.
But so much of it is qualitative data,
Sure.
taking non-financial, non-numerical data and associating some type of value to it. Mm-hmm. Is that fair to say, or how would you?
Economics is a quantitative field. There's no doubt about it.
Right.
And the joke is that when you're doing a PhD in econ, like for a couple of years, you're basically doing a PhD in math, right? And so depending on the degree, depending on the field, and we try to quantify as many things as possible. And I'll just give you an example, and not to get into the weeds, but the concept of willingness to pay is a way of taking something that's qualitative, right? And so, for example, hey, Chris, you care about the whales, you want to save the whales, right? And so that's great, but how do we take this interest in saving the whales and quantify it, right? And so I can potentially set up a survey that tries to recover how much Chris is willing to be taxed in order for the city of Wilmington to save the whales, right? And so that's a way of taking something that's qualitative and recovering an estimate for it that allows policymakers to make decisions that are informed, right? And so, and that can be done about open space, that can be done about a lot of things. However, as you said, in the real world, we move really fast. And a lot of the time, you don't have time to do an in-depth analysis. Mm-hmm. You don't have time to gather all of the data. And a lot of the time, you're under the gun to make decisions under imperfect information. Right. And therefore, you're having to make these qualitative assessments based on either things that are similar, that happened in the past, your understanding of what's going on, your biases. And so that's where, I don't want to say there is a disconnect, but there is some tension between academic economists and the policy world, the real world, because academic economists, and I'm one of them, I kind of travel both worlds. We want to be super careful. We want to take our time. We want to do our due diligence. And we want to make sure that we dot our I's and cross our T's. And that means sometimes it takes 3 years to publish a paper. As you know, decision makers want an answer yesterday.
Right, exactly.
Right, so there are a lot of criticisms of the field, and one of them is, are we potentially writing papers in academic journals that 6.5 people are reading? And is that really good research making its way into the policy world, right? And so how do you bridge that gap where people, don't need to see all the math? Can you boil this down to me? Or can you tell me, to your point earlier, how does this matter for Wilmington? Or how does this matter for residents of this zip code? Or something like that. And so, and not everybody has the same background, right? And so it's also, there is this I don't want to call it gatekeeping, but language can be a barrier, right? And so, economics is a jargon-heavy discipline, and that tends to keep people away from it. The thing that is concerning, maybe is too strong, is that then that opens up a world where who are the policymakers getting their information from? If the academic economists are disconnected and the people that are knowledgeable and doing good work are not speaking the same language, they're not writing for this audience, they're not presenting in a way that keeps people awake, then there's a vacuum, and who is it being filled by, and are they getting the wrong information? So there are some big questions about, again, how do we bridge the gap? And I think I've told you before, one of the really attractive things about my field, that is regional economics, is that it dances between academia and the policy world, right? And so, and I personally put a great deal of emphasis, and I attempt as much as possible to play that translational role, right? And so I do academic research, and I'm proud of the work that we do there, but a lot of the questions that I pursue are informed by things that I see, things that I hear. And then in my previous job, one of the things we did is we would write policy briefs for every academic paper that would allow a person that's never thought about the topic that I've spent the last year and a half thinking about to read and go, oh, either that's super interesting, or, well, of course, that's super obvious, you know. Why did you waste your year doing it? But you know, but that's really why I really like regional economics, because there is a focus on being an asset to communities, to regions, to states, and to try and communicate in a way that's transparent, that's clear, and to your earlier point, that adds value to the people who are listening, who are thinking about some of these big questions.
Yeah, no, that's, and especially in today's world where things move so quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, everything, with the introduction of technology and now artificial intelligence, everything just grows at an exponential rate, right? I mean, it's so, to your point of, you know, maybe 15 years ago, you know, it took a year or two to write a paper, you know, maybe that was okay. But now things are moving and changing so quick. To be relevant and to be able to provide people with, you know, information they need, you have to make some assumptions. I mean, maybe assumptions isn't the right word, but you can do so much research, but then at some point you've got to be able to connect the dots or make some connection to, you know, to what things are happening. Like, tell me. So
that, again, this is maybe a window into academia that you're not interested in, but we started the conversation with incentives, right? And so people that work at universities, at least, and that's who I'm talking about now, respond to incentives. What does that mean?
Right.
Most tenure decisions are based on publications.
Yes.
And publications are gonna determine people's futures, which means if you tell somebody, hey, in order for you to have tenure, in order for you to have a raise, in order for you to keep your job, I need you to publish 6 papers in these fancy journals, that's what people are going to do, right? And one of the things that I think that there is, like, this large shift now that's happening is universities are being evaluated on this very broad term called impact. But I think it matters, right? And so we don't know really how well defined it is, but rather than thinking about, let's check the boxes, right? How many of these publications did this person get? How much impact did their work actually have?
Yeah, how do you measure that?
Well, and that's where it gets super tricky, right? And so, but I mean, one of the things that people are talking about is, again, coming back to your earlier point, like, are businesses being started? Are you consulting with the governor or the mayor or
the chamber?
Exactly, right? And so there are a lot of different ways of, are you improving people's lives?
I like that.
Are you contributing to the welfare of this community that partially pays your salary? Right? How is this knowledge being potentially translated, used in ways that are tangible? Again, they don't really have a great definition, but it's moving from this narrow way of counting beans or counting publications into a little bit of a broader sense of, educate the citizenry, add value to the public, help businesses, and that's going to vary depending on the field. There are clearly and I don't want to make this seem like everything needs to be applied, because there are theoretical fields that are never going to affect our lives on a day-to-day basis, but they add massive value 10, 20 years from now.
Yes.
And there is room for that. But at least when it comes to applied economics, I think that there is this increased shift towards impact.
So when you came from University of Alaska?
Yeah, University of Alaska,
When
Anchorage.
you came from University of Alaska Anchorage to UNCW, when you were, and this was right before COVID, and it was put on hold, and you finally made it here. But during your interview process and as part of your job description, how much of it was about, hey, Mouhcine, we want you to get involved in the community, we want you to give speaks? Is that something that was part, or is that something that you've taken upon yourself to be more impactful into the community?
No, it wasn't tightly written. But it was part of the job. And to be honest with you, it was a feature of the job that was attractive, because that was one of the things that I did at the University of Alaska, right? And so I had this joint appointment between I was a professor there, but I had a joint appointment between an economics department and this think tank.
Yes.
And the think tank did a lot of research, applied research and academic research for the state, for businesses, but we gave a lot of testimony in front of the legislature, worked closely with businesses, did a lot of economic impact analyses, a lot of economic forecasts. And I really like that balance, right? And so I like to keep my toes in the academic world, to stay abreast of what's going on, stay in touch with the literature, use the latest methods. But there was this itch to do this other thing, right? And so because that you go and speak to an audience that hasn't thought about these things, and that stuff is clicking and it's making a difference. And that's a very different thing than sending a paper to a journal and not hearing for 6 months, right? And
exactly.
So the jobs that I was thinking about are ones that, like, a prerequisite was this needed to be part of the equation, right? And my predecessor, Adam Jones, was doing a version of what I'm doing right now, right? And so UNCW has this rich tradition of community involvement. And as you know, the Swain Center does a lot of community outreach. And one of the tentacles of the Swain Center is to do economic development. And economic development is typically through the reach of the regional economist. And so that's kind of the role that I play. Each person is going to do the job differently. And so some people are going to be more out than others. Some people are going to do research in specific areas rather than others. And it evolves as well, right? And so I think about it as being a liaison to the community. I think about it as adding value to some of these conversations we were talking about, as being a resource, right? And so that could mean you come to me and you say, hey, you do economic forecasts, can you help me with something? And that could mean a specific project, or it just could mean, hey, I want to talk to you about something for the next 45 minutes and just kind of pick your brain on something, right? And so my goal / role is to add value, right? And so that's kind of how I think about it. Is the way I say yay or nay to stuff is, do I think this is going to add value? Right.
I think that is a fantastic way to determine what you're gonna do. Is, am I adding value? I mean,
it's fundamental, but it really is. It helps me again, just kind of block out the noise. Right. There are certain things that I'm not good at, that I'm not a fit for. There's no point in me doing them. There are others where I think, oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that this makes sense. Clearly, I have other responsibilities that I have to weigh, but if I can add value, then I'm going to try to do it.
That's awesome. Yeah. And especially when you're working with small and medium-sized businesses, the things that you do to help them has an immediate impact on real people.
Absolutely.
And I think there's nothing better than that tangible outcome of seeing people think of something differently, be able to improve their business, which helps them hire more people or pay their employees more, provide them with health benefits and 401k. And it's just a cycle of good stuff.
Absolutely. No, I mean, like I said, I think about one of the tools that regional economists use a lot is economic impact analysis. And you just described basically in the real world how that is done, right? And so the idea is like whenever a company hires a person, it doesn't just hire that person. That person's income supports the barber and the restaurant and the bar, and the every time there is growth, there is this reverberation of economic activity that tends to occur, right? And so, and a lot of what I think about is how do you maximize that reverberation? How do you ensure that when you're thinking about economic development or thinking about economic growth, how do you make sure that the money that's coming into the area is sticking in the area? How do you minimize leakage? How do you think about these connectedness across industries, across businesses, and how do you measure it, right? And so that if you're thinking about giving somebody an incentive, that you don't overpay for the incentive. When you're thinking about how much of a contribution does a company make, can we do that evaluation in a transparent way that allows a policymaker to look at it and look at those costs and benefits and say, yeah, this makes sense.
How do you come up with your like main ideas of researching or things? It's like you're taking your kids out for ice cream and you just notice something and you're like, oh my gosh, I just came up with an idea. Or tell me about how you kind of narrow down what am I going to focus on? What am I going to spend my time on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's at the intersection of what am I good at? What do I have some sort of special skill or advantage in pursuing? Is there good data to do it? There are tons and tons of really nice questions.
Yep.
I could spend 2 years just spinning my wheels and really make no progress whatsoever.
Right.
And I have this kind of, I'll come back to the question, I promise, but there is this tension in my head and in the field of economics as well of, should we be pursuing big questions that we can't answer well? Or should we pick questions that are not maybe the most important, but we can answer really well and causally?
Got it.
And that tension is very real, right? And so because most of us who are trained in economics are dissuaded from pursuing big, messy questions that you can't, but that's the world, right? So there is a little bit of that I think about, right? So when there is a question that kind of percolates in my head, I go, are there other people that are better set up to answer it? Do I have the tools to do it? Is there some specific advantage? Meaning, and data is a big part of this, right? And so you have to be able to find data in order to answer that question, right? So can I get the data? I always, this is a very specific story, but I think I told you before that I spent the last 7 years really just thinking and doing research about universal basic income.
Yes.
A very specific form of it.
Yep.
Which is the distribution of the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend, because Alaska is oil rich. It set up this investment fund that has about $75 or $80 billion with a B right now, and so it takes a portion of the returns of the fund and then distributes that money to the public. And one of the big questions when I was living in Alaska, so you're asking about how, so I had lived there for a couple of years, and there's this super interesting program. I'm getting these distributions, all of my friends are getting them, and you're reading these op-eds about it's good, it's bad, it's doing this, it's causing crime, it's resulting in people migrating into the area, and I'm like, oh, that's idiotic, oh, that makes sense. Well, maybe I should see if I can answer this.
Maybe I can answer some of these questions.
But really, so one of our very first papers I think it's a good paper, we had hired this colleague of ours, and we were talking, and we said, I really want to start this research agenda that's actually cutting through the noise. We live in this state, we're invested in it. Just oil prices were starting to drop. There were these proposals to eliminate this program. We have an advantage here. I think we should really start thinking very carefully about what it does and what it doesn't do.
Right.
And so one of the first questions, I don't know how we were talking about it, and I said, somebody was saying that whenever people get this money, all they do is go out, drink, and cause all sorts of crime. And I said, oh, well, that's interesting. And so 2 days later or something, I was driving from my place to work, and I see a police station, and I literally park and I walk in, and I go, hey, I'm this person. You've never heard of me. Can I pitch you something?
Yeah.
And it's just like a clerk, and they're like, I don't care. And I literally said, is there any way I can get every interaction that every police officer has had with people that live in Anchorage for the last 20 years or something? And they go, I have no idea. And so they go and ask somebody, and that person comes up, and they go, sure. You need to bring $40 and a couple USBs. And I go, seriously? And they go, yeah. And so I just like drive to work, and I'm like, where can I get this data? And they're like, no, I don't think so. And 2 days later, I get this email, and they're like, stuff is ready. Come get your data. And so it was anonymized and everything. Right. But we literally had data on every interaction between police officers and individuals that are labeled by day, by hours of the day.
Yeah.
And so the next step was, okay, now we have this data. We know when this distribution happens. We have the techniques to isolate this. Let's figure out what actually happens.
How cool.
Yeah, and so there is a lot of that. And so it's kind of this, inspired by stuff that's happening around me, inspired by the other stream of research that I spent a lot of time on is we talk a lot about economic development, and the oil industry was very prevalent in Alaska, and
right.
And people would say oil improves the well-being of people. Oil drives the Alaska economy. And one of the questions I always used to think about is, well, whose welfare is being improved? Yeah. Is it Chris, who lives in Wilmington and flies to Alaska, goes commuting? Do they migrate?
Right.
Is it people who used to be unemployed? So let's do a decomposition of this stuff, right? And so, and I joke with I teach a regional economics class, and I joke with them that if nothing else, hopefully at the end of a regional economics class, you develop a really good BS detector.
Yes.
Or you ask that secondary or tertiary question. You see somebody, and it's like, most of the problems, econ-related problems, are problems of attribution. Mm-hmm. We attribute stuff to things that are not related, right? And so that's that was a long-winded answer to how do you come up with questions. It's motivated by these kind of conversations. It's people asking questions. It's seeing stuff in the paper. It's scrolling Twitter and going, I wonder if that's true. One of the things that I'm kind of now playing around with is, and it's related to the area, and it's motivated actually by stuff that I do as part of my regional economist portion of the job, is housing prices have exploded. Mm-hmm. And there are these articles that are pointing to migration of the elderly in particular as being responsible for pushing up prices. And again, you and I can sit here and speculate about how much of that increase is due to migration or migration of a specific subset of the population, but I haven't tested that hypothesis. And so I'm like, well, I have all of the data, and I know I have a creative way of potentially getting at it. Well, let me actually just do it. And so that's what I'm doing.
So I want to go back to the crime records. And first, I want to say that was a very entrepreneurial way of doing
appreciate it.
I
try to.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. That's like taking practical, real life, data and using it to answer a legitimate question. So I got to ask, what did you guys find out?
So interesting enough, we found really, I think, intuitive stuff. So alcohol-related arrest interactions increase a little bit in the couple of weeks post-distribution.
Okay.
Interestingly, property crime-related arrests decrease in the 3 weeks following the distribution.
Interesting.
So almost the crimes that are committed because of need drop. We do find some increase in alcohol-related stuff. But I think the takeaway, at least for me, is on an annualized basis. So if you take that result and annualize it, the results are zero. So really, the thing that one of the ways, one of the lenses through which we were looking at that research program, because we ended up doing papers on crime, on employment, because that was one of the big questions, right? And so it's like, are people just sitting in their basement playing video games? Right. But with the crime thing people think about program evaluation as, if I analyze a program, I better find like a big effect. And to me, not finding an effect is just as important, if not more important, right? And so irrespective of how one may feel about universal basic income, to me, the takeaway from that paper is, if you're at the margin and you really want to implement it and it checks all the boxes, but you're like, oh, but I'm worried about crime, to me that says that's not really a dimension you should be worried about, right? And
exactly.
So that's kind of how I think about the takeaway from that paper is, this is really not it. I mean, you may not want to do it for a lot of other reasons, but that doesn't matter. That's not the point of this. To me, that paper conclusively answers that people don't just go and blow all of the money on alcohol, because we do a lot of back of the envelope stuff, and the increases are fairly small, and they're very concentrated around like the 2 weeks post distribution.
Got it. No, that's a really good example of what incentivizes people to do something, right?
Exactly.
And that's kind of what we defined economics as, is the study of what incentivizes people to do stuff.
100%. Because again, I mean, it's, like I said, I mean, I think, I don't know if I said it here or not, but like, it's a distribution. It's not big, but it's it's average since inception, 82 was inception, to now, we're about $1,600 per person. Yeah. So a family of 4 is getting $8,000, right? And so that's a chunk of change that changes at the margin again. Are you working that second shift? Are you going out on a Friday night? Are you changing apartments? Are you getting that prescription drug, right? And so, and these are all questions that we're collectively asking. And to me, it's like coming back to thinking about questions, right? And so I was living in this place that was a laboratory. People don't think about it as such for this experiment. And then you start hearing about, oh, well, there is this country that's now thinking about implementing it. Oh, we were talking about AI. Will automation result in the destruction of jobs? And if so,
oh my gosh,
what do you do?
Well,
but like, so again, typically when people think about basic income, they think about it in the context of either providing an income floor to people, or what role will automation play in our economy? And if it does result in the elimination of 30% of the current jobs, what happens, right? And so, and are you then pushed into having to seriously consider this stuff? And again, I'm not suggesting that our research gives you all the answers, but it's a first step towards kind of answering some of those things.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's a perfect segue to talk more, specifically about Wilmington and what's going on here. And what are the biggest most important questions we need to answer for our local economy here?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot, to be honest with you, and to me, there are a couple, and I'll start and interrupt, obviously, but so the first one that I've been thinking about a lot is, how do we recalibrate expectations for the next couple of years, given that we've had this explosive growth, massive in-migration, employment growth, income injection, but the world has changed, right? And so we're now 4 years post-COVID, 3.5 years. How do we set ourselves up to where we take advantage of that positive boost, make sure that infrastructure keeps up with growth, but at the same time, be realistic about the trajectory, right? So you're a businessman, forecasting under the best of circumstances, some people would say is a fool's errand, right? And so right now, there is even more uncertainty, but I think that shouldn't dissuade us from asking these hard questions about.
You've got to.
Yeah, you that's exactly it. You can't afford not to.
Otherwise, you're just burying your head in the sand and just.
And that's it. So again, to me, that's kind of like that's top of mind right now. Is great growth, very fast growth, changing, affordability is declining. So what does that mean?
Yeah, what does that mean for us down the road, and is it sustainable?
And there you go. That's I'm long-winded. That's a much more concise. No. But I mean, you're right. That's a much more concise way. What does it mean, right? And so, but it's. I really have been thinking about it a lot, and I've been saying it like people talking. I really think about it as a recalibration of expectations, right? And so. Can't keep growing at 10% a year. You have to think about what does the last 2 years mean in the context of the last 10 years, and how do you marry, the last 10 years with the COVID growth, with the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years? What are the pain points? And, what is Wilmington 3.0, right? And so we've gone from, there are myths about Wilmington that it's still a leisure and hospitality-based industry. That's clearly no longer the case. I mean, it's clearly a driver, but it's no longer the case, right? Healthcare is a big deal. Finance is a big deal, right? And so they're not as big, but we have a higher share of higher paying sectors, right? And so there's a myth that only retirees are moving here. I posted some data a few weeks ago that we're the 10th fastest growing metro for those ages 25 to 39.
Wow.
Right?
So in the country?
In the country, amongst metropolitan areas that have more than 250,000 people, right? And so that's percentage growth. It's not absolute numbers.
Right.
But
that's a more normalized way of looking at it, right?
Exactly. I mean, that's the correct way. I'm just saying. Yes. But so this is like, there is a story behind the surface. But again, it's like, so the recalibration of expectations is both in terms of we need to do away with this kind of old identity or these kind of like do away with these myths that may be dragging the reputation or the way people think about the area.
And sorry, I got to...
Please.
And it's cool to see how different organizations within the community are actually doing that. For example, the NC Career Coast initiative that the Chamber is doing with other organizations is part of just that, that this is a place where you can come and work and live and not, it's not. So sorry, I just had to.
No. By all means, that's exactly right. So it's leverage. So again, not to come back to research, but it's you have to start by painting a picture of what does the place, what did it look like? What does it look like now? What do we want it to look like going forward, right? And so and come back to policy. What are the investments necessary in order to have this vision come to life, right? And so,
and resources are finite, and we need to focus those resources on the highest ROI. In pure business terms.
But that's exactly right. And again, there is the tension, obviously, like anything else, with priorities for you are not necessarily the same thing as priorities for me. And so how do you come to the table and think clearly about, again, this unified vision? But right now, like I said, so like and lastly, I'll just close with this is, and I know you don't believe this, but there are a lot of people that think, oh, growth is fantastic. And it is, but growth is never painless. And figuring out ways to minimize said pain and also be proactive as opposed to reactive, right? And so every single area that's grown super fast, especially during COVID, has found itself a little bit behind the eight ball, right? And so, and it's not necessarily their fault, because you have to also be careful, because you need to gauge how much of the growth is permanent and how much of it is temporary.
Right.
And that's one of the questions that I still have about the area as well, right? And so yes, there is growth. There's no doubt about it. And yes, it's happening from a lot of different sources. But example that I don't know how to answer is, how many of the remote workers that have moved here have since been called back to work, have moved out?
Right.
I don't know, right? And so anyway, so that's kind of like, those are the topics that I've been thinking about a lot.
Got it. And part of that is like, growth, but at what cost, right? Yeah. Because, for example, we're bringing in more high-paying jobs. There's people moving in from out of town with high New York or California salaries, which are driving up home prices and pushing out folks that, might not be able to afford that. And so that's a cost.
We were just talking about this a second ago, right? And so, and I said, I'll use the pompous sounding framework in my mind. I think about this as, to whom do the benefits actually accrue?
Right.
When you think about economic development, right? And so that's the fundamental question, right? And so clearly I want growth, but if you're thinking about quality of life, typically when economic development is done, it's done through the lens of the original resident of the place.
Okay.
Meaning, I want growth,
right,
but I want it to lift the people that are already here, right? And so if people are unemployed and I bring a new plant, I want the unemployed person to get the job. Or if I have people that had already given up and have dropped out of the labor force, I want that person to take the job, right? And so,
I think most people would want that.
No. Right. And this is not a criticism of how things are done, but that's kind of the lens through which you typically want to look at this question. Now, to your point, clearly, to me at least, when I think about Wilmington, it's like, what's the value proposition?
Right.
Historically, or over the last 10, 15 years, high quality of life, low cost of living. So, getting to your point, if the growth is putting downward pressure on quality of life because of infrastructure, or because of other factors, and if the original residents are being negatively affected, right? And so those are things that you absolutely have to think about, right? There are no easy answers, but we started with cost benefits. We started with incentives.
Yes.
That's where most of the sauce is made, right? And so is, how do I try at least to make sure that these original residents, these people that have lived there for a long time, are benefiting from these new riches, that they're not being pushed out. And part of the solution, is clearly, we talk about housing. There are no topics that economists agree on, except for the fact that one of the things you can do when areas, or even if they're not becoming unaffordable, is increase housing supply, right? And so from a policy perspective, relaxing constraints around housing supply is one of the things that should be going hand in hand with making sure that we're able to absorb this growth and it's not pushing out some of these people that you're talking about. And then you have to make sure again that the infrastructure is keeping up with this, right? Because again, quality of life is massively important. One of the things that I think about a lot is, again, and we saw this during COVID. I was just telling my students earlier that 4 million people moved to the South between 2020 and 2023. Which means that people vote with their feet and they vote with their pocketbooks.
Yes.
We're conditioned to think about businesses doing that, right? And so businesses tell governments all the time, hey, I need X, Y, and Z. If you don't give me X, Y, and Z, South Carolina is calling.
Exactly.
Right? And I'm going to go.
Exactly.
But people do that as well. And economic development is no longer happening just through companies that hire 500 people. It's also being done by small businesses, by individuals. And we're seeing a lot of firms following people, right? And so one of the big questions in regional economics is, do jobs follow people or do people follow jobs?
Interesting.
And what we've seen over the last 20 years is we're seeing this increasing trend of jobs following people. Meaning smart people, either entrepreneurs, move to areas where they want to live and they create their own jobs, right? Or once you have a concentration of these individuals, firms go, oh, there are a bunch of smart people in this place. I want to be there because that's where they want to live. And so that's, again, another long-winded way of saying quality of life, ensuring that quality of life remains high is massive, because you can't take growth for granted. And again, people vote with their feet and their pocketbooks. And if quality of life is jeopardized, right? People are going to react to that and they're going to move to the next town that's cheaper or that's investing in the amenities, in the things that people care about.
And Wilmington fits that, that so well in that it's a great place to live. Cost of living was, probably still is. Compared to other large metro areas, Wilmington is probably still more affordable than a Charlotte or a Raleigh or definitely a New York.
If you're coming from New York, it's still a great deal.
Exactly. For sure.
And the joke is you run into people at breweries who say, I'm only paying $3,000 for a 2-bedroom. I was paying $5,500. Exactly. And most people are like, what? So it depends, right? And so, but yeah, it clearly has gotten considerably more expensive on almost every single dimension, but it's still much more affordable than northeastern cities in particular, or the West Coast like the San Franciscos, right?
And then quality of life comes into play. It's like, I live in DC and I spend 2 hours on the Beltway each day commuting to work. I could, I'm not doing that anymore.
And that's what and that's, again, coming back to this idea of like where is the growth coming from, and are people and are some of these decisions that people made during COVID are these real lifestyle changes, right? And so these people that had been doing these 2-hour commutes and then moved in and they're like, oh, I can drive 10 minutes and get to work, or I can work from home and make New York salaries and live in Wilmington. That's fantastic, right? And so I think that we have some really big questions ahead, and then clearly we're part of the larger macro economy, right? And so the backdrop to all of this is, yes, there are Wilmington-specific factors, but we're part of a national economy that's slowing a little bit, where interest rates had been essentially zero for years, and inflation has reared its ugly head. The Fed raised rates, and so the backdrop of a lot of this is what happens to interest rates, at least in the short run. is partially gonna determine what happens to the housing market locally. Right. And so what companies like yours are going to do in terms of hiring or growth, right? And so I say to everybody, the thing that's scariest for businesses or for policymakers is not necessarily economic decline, but uncertainty, because uncertainty just causes paralysis.
Yep, absolutely. And you can't fix an indecision. You can fix a bad decision, right? And that analysis paralysis, that stuff I talk about with clients all the time is, we're going to gather as much data as we can, within realistic time frame, because we've got to make a decision, right? And we're going to make the best decision. But if we don't ever make a decision, then we're just stuck. We're not going anywhere.
Well, I mean, and that's the thing right now. Again, is like the broad macroeconomy is in this kind of, I don't want to call it an inflection point, but it's this really interesting time where inflation seems to be under control, right? And so maybe they're going to pull the elusive soft landing that everybody's been talking about, meaning that they've been able to contain inflation without causing significant damage to the labor market.
Right.
But, people, I think, are way too quick to celebrate and say, interest rates are going to drop, by whatever percentage.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's really where we're heading. And again, ideally nobody is making, some people are, but nobody is sitting going, what's the Fed going to do next month, right? And so,
I mean, part of that, this is a tough question to even ask, and I don't know if it's going to make sense, but the stock market, a couple examples, the stock market, interest rates, and just general news headlines. Whether the information, take for example, interest rates are going to go down, right? Whether that has an actual real impact versus what the perceived impact is that drives decision making, it's amazing to see. A news article comes out, it says something, it could be completely false and not real and not grounded on any data or have actually any impact, but it changes consumer mindset to say, oh, interest rates are going down, great, I'm gonna go build a house, for example. So I guess, that wasn't a question, it was more of just, I guess more of an observation from someone who doesn't, isn't a professional economist, but it's like, I guess, how much of this, I guess in 08, 09, they called it quantitative easing, bringing interest rates down at a slow rate. How much of that do you think is going to have a legitimate positive impact on the way our economic system actually works versus what just the perception of it is?
Yeah. So, I'll answer it in two parts. So, do expectations matter? 100%.
Yeah.
Right? And businesses make decisions largely based on expectations, right? And so whether or not you hire 5 people is contingent on how much business you think you're going to do next year, right? And so, how much in sales you're going to make. But there is also evidence that macroeconomic factors themselves influence what you do. You're a finance person. You mentioned ROI earlier. Some projects are only going to pencil out if the interest rate is below X.
Right. Exactly.
So
yes.
So that's the other side of this, right? And so some people are only going to qualify for that $450,000 home if the interest rate is Y.
Right.
So there is no doubt that interest rates govern a lot of the decisions that people make, because, again, whether it's how big of a payment I can make or how big of a project I can take on. The other thing that we saw, and maybe this is good or bad, is, for example, and I'm just going to pick on the tech sector here, we saw massive growth in a sector that was taking on risky projects because money was free. Right? And so that's not an expectation thing. That's, can I or can I not afford playing around with the virtual universe, right? And if I can borrow $1 billion at 0%, well, sure.
Right.
But if the interest rate is 11%, that makes no sense. And we are right now seeing some of that adjustment, right? And so it's like, you know this better than I, but companies that grew too fast because they were making decisions based on a low interest rate environment and now are having to readjust, right?
Right,
so,
exactly.
So yes to both. Do expectations matter? No doubt about it. And does the anticipation of a rate cut potentially change my decisions today? No doubt about it. But does the interest rate environment itself affect decisions? Also, I think undoubtedly yes. And right now, I think what's interesting is we've gotten obviously used to a really low interest rate environment.
Yeah.
And the hikes were so sudden. But what was fascinating, and maybe there is a lag effect, maybe this is going into the weeds, but one of the fascinating things is the interest insensitivity of so many sectors. And what I mean by that is you would have thought that once interest rates started increasing, the Fed, at least from their vantage point, this is not them saying this is me saying it, they wanted to break something.
Right.
They wanted to break either the labor market or consumer spending. How do you break the labor market? Well, you make it really expensive for businesses to borrow.
Right.
If you make it expensive for businesses to borrow, they're going to start scaling back. Economic activity is going to pull back and inflation is going to come down.
Interesting.
Okay. Or if I increase interest rate enough, consumers are now no longer buying that second truck or that boat because the interest rates are too high. They're going to pull back. Inflation is going to come down. And one of the things that was fascinating is how few sectors actually got affected by these increases in interest rates, right? And so we saw tech pull back, but again, they were living in fantasy land because interest rates were zero. And then we saw real estate and some manufacturing declines, nationally that is, right? And so, but other than that, the economy just kept on rolling, right? So is that because a lot of businesses did not have loans, had cash reserves, and therefore the interest, this lending channel really was not affecting them as much? Is it because a bunch of individuals were sitting on tons of cash that they accumulated over the pandemic? And again, I'm not borrowing money, I'm paying cash for that boat, right? And so what do I care that interest rates are 8%, right? And so again, like one of the big questions was, how is it that interest rates are increasing at this rate and yet, I mean, I always make the joke, like every restaurant is busy. Businesses are still hiring. Economic activity is still plugging along. And so, and you know, the uncertainty now going forward is, are businesses sensitive? Are individuals sensitive? It's just that there is a lag effect. And a lot of these changes just have not actually been seen by the day. We just have felt it as much. And now we're going to feel it. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, and that's a great question to answer. And you can, like, for example, looking at the different data points is, you know, consumers had the highest level of savings that they've had in a certain amount of time. But also another part is, in one of my favorite parts of economics is utility, right? How much enjoyment am I getting from this purchase or from this activity that I don't care how much it costs. I'm going to enjoy it, you know? And I think, and maybe COVID made people realize that, hey, you know, things can change really quickly. And you know what? I'm going to live for today and maybe save it. I don't know.
No. I was telling somebody the other day, and I made this joke, and I said, I'm not a psychologist. I don't play one on TV, but I can speculate that maybe something broke, right? And so the way, again, talking finance, maybe we've become much more present oriented. We're discounting at a much higher rate, right? And so we're just thinking so much more about the present. And there was this really interesting article in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was, that basically was making this argument that so many younger people in particular are viewing the housing market as so unaffordable that they're taking money that they would have otherwise saved for a down payment and shifting it towards experiences and spending, right? And maybe this is partially that, partially to your point, well, maybe there is another pandemic around the corner. What am I saving this money for, right? And so, and I really don't, I mean, again, I talk about this a lot, but I've been continually surprised as to how resilient consumer spending has been. Mm-hmm. And it's driven, I mean, 2/3 of our economy is consumer spending, right? And so the economy goes as the consumer goes, and the consumer has just been incredibly resilient. And the thing that's even more surprising is the disconnect that there is between consumer sentiment and consumer spending. Consumer sentiment has been unbelievably negative. So the University of Michigan has been doing these surveys for years now, and it asks about how people are feeling about their economy, about their job, about their community, a range of questions. And most people are basically saying things are horrible. And yet, we're spending, wages are going up faster than inflation, right? And so even nationally, locally, they've been going up faster than inflation throughout the pandemic. And so we're still spending, even though we're feeling fairly negative about things. And again, I was telling somebody the other day that this is not me saying it, but again, coming back to psychology, maybe it's because people are attributing the raises they're getting to their hard work and the fact that they're an incredible employee, but they're attributing most of the price increases and the inflation to terrible government policy. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of potentially explains why I'm continuing to spend and why I'm very negative about the state of the economy. And so it's somebody else's fault that prices are going up. It's to my credit that, I got a 30% raise, and, that's what's going on. I don't know.
So kind of to move towards concluding on our conversation and local folks and business owners being able to take something away from this, what would you say are some of the main indicators, financial indicators, whether it's interest rates or home prices or fuel prices, or what would be, the top indicators if you were a small business owner that you would kind of pay attention to that would give me a feeling about what, the next 6 to 12 months maybe looks like in terms of opportunity or growth or contraction or something like that?
So clearly nationally, what the Fed does, I think, is going to be really instructive in terms of, because I think it's going to tell us what their read is on the national economy. Okay. Locally, the thing that I've been paying a lot of attention to is migration. Okay.
And you've put out a ton of data on this.
Yeah. Right. So that's the part to me, because again, the Wilmington economy is very diversified. It's grown a lot, but the migration story to me is central to what's been going on, right? And so again, coming back, we started with this idea of how do we recalibrate expectations?
Yes.
Well, the next 6-12 months to me, from where so the reason I say this, and this is not going to be long-winded, I promise, is migration at the state level peaked in 2022. Okay. People are still moving to these areas, but the rate at which they're coming has slowed. Okay. Because the tailwinds, pandemic-driven tailwinds, have faded.
Got it.
Right. So I would certainly pay attention to interest rates, and I would be very curious locally. We talked about affordability. So interest rates, migration, and then you talked about housing and affordability. The thing that I think about a lot is prices froze for the last year. Nobody would have guessed that prices were going to keep climbing even at 8% interest rate, right? But they kept climbing because, and this is a data point from Redfin, 89% of homeowners nationally have an interest rate of 6% or less. So why do I mention that? The reason that prices kept climbing locally is because while demand cratered, a lot of people just no longer were willing to buy, when interest rates are climbing. Sellers also pulled inventory out.
Right, because they didn't want to get out of their low interest rate and basically refi it into a higher rate.
Exactly. Got it. Nobody wants to trade a 2% for an 8%.
No way.
So the question now, fundamentally, is as hopefully the fight to curb inflation has been won or nearly won, and interest rates start coming down, how many of these home sellers or would-be home sellers jump back in?
Yep.
And how many buyers are sitting on the sidelines and are coming back in? And that's why migration matters so much.
Got it.
So we're going to end on the demand and supply.
Yeah, that's great. But the last couple years have been the most perfect example of supply and demand.
Of course.
It's like supply and demand at its finest.
Absolutely. It's just, it's poetry at work, right?
It is. And I'm a totally believe in, free market capitalism and supply and demand kind of rules everything. And, if you didn't believe that, then look back at the last couple years and there's your
No, I use that example in my principles class all the time, and I tell them, look, the invisible hand at work, right? And so you would think that there is some czar or some person that's dictating behavior, but really it's demand, it's individual actors acting independently, and that's what we get.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your time and for coming on.
Yeah.
Where, if I'm out there and I want to follow you, I know you're on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
What other?
I have a Twitter account. I don't use it, but reach out by email. That's really the easiest way. My phone number is on the university's website. If you have questions, reach out by email. Call me.
Cool.
I'm available.
We'll put a link to your page on in the show notes and all that stuff.
Sounds good.
If people want to find you, they know where to.
Sounds good.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Mouhcine.
Thanks for having me. Yeah. I enjoyed it.